Welcome to Dig on America, where we speak truth to power. Every week, we give you the dig on how American history, policies, and media created the social and political issues we face today. DOA is independent media supported by listeners, but they'll tell you we're just fake news, deep state propaganda, funded by George Soros, the Clinton Foundation, BLM Marxists, and
Ghostface Killer,
Dorothy Mantooth,
Jordan Peterson,
Scott Frost.
Whoa, you're very loud there.
I think we're brought to us by the documents recovered from Melania Trump's closet.
I saw a right-wing meme the other day, and I usually scroll past them. This one was fucking hilarious, so I'll give it some space. The guy goes, it was a picture of Merrick Garland, and he says, the raid of Melania Trump's closet definitely was worth it.
Oh, yeah.
And it was him, and I found this glamorous gown and this fabulous hat, and they like superimposed this hat and this gown on Merrick Garland, and I laughed.
It was an excellent Photoshop job.
Yeah, I laughed for like 5 minutes. It was fucking like, I have a sense of humor. Okay, it was funny. I give them that one. They got a win there. They own the libs on that one.
did you see the one?
Mikey's
where it
still
says,
playing.
The FBI informant struggles to maintain their secret identity, and they had Melania with just a fake mustache on. That one was funny.
My name is John Bolton, or what did he go by? John
Bon Jolton.
No, Trump used to go by John Barron. John Barron is what he was.
Oh yeah, when he was fake calling the news, like tell everybody I'm a
I
billionaire.
remember that shit.
Tell everybody I'm the richest man in the world.
My name is John Barron.
And this was when he was still campaigning. This shit was coming out.
No, this was back in the 80s.
Like years ago.
That's what I'm saying, but it was coming out during the campaign, and people still traced into the freaking voting booth.
Oh, the story of how he single-handedly not single-handedly, but he had a big play in destroying the USFL, the original one, is astonishing. You know,
didn't that get destroyed because they tried to go at the same time as the NFL?
Who do you think wanted them to do that? He wouldn't let his team play unless they moved to Sundays.
Well, not only that, but the
During
10
the
times
season.
a year.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. He wanted to directly compete with them, and the reason why he wanted to do it, and he's on, and this is multiple sources have confirmed this. He thought that the New York, New Jersey Generals, his team, was the most profitable team in the league, and if the XFL, the USFL failed, that them and then his buddy owned the Las Vegas Gamblers, so those two teams would be added to the NFL as expansion teams. So he was doing it. He was tanking the league in order to get his team in the NFL. Because if you don't know the backstory, Trump tried to be an NFL owner for a long time, and they wouldn't let him in. So he was trying to backdoor his way in. So he destroyed a league.
To save his life.
He fucking Isaiah Thomas that league before Isaiah Thomas did that.
Well, you know why Trump Tower exists is because they wouldn't let him buy anything on Billionaire Row.
Or in Vegas, I believe.
Well, yeah, that's why the Taj Mahal existed.
And went public and then tanked.
Well, this is Jason Dutch. You are listening to Dig on America. I am here with the fabulous Instagrammer attorney Anna. Hello.
Hey y'all, not an Instagrammer.
Pizza's not good. Birds aren't real. Big Haas.
What the business is.
After this show ends, immediately following this show, flip over to Haas's, just search YouTube. We'll put the link in here in a minute. Mikey will do it. He's fucking sitting around the back. Mikey, throw the link to Haas's Humidor's YouTube channel, or you can watch it right here, preferably, to watch Haas's cigar review. And with us also, Irish Swede, economist extraordinaire and anarchist extraordinaire. Hello, Irish Swede.
Power to the people.
and a guy who peddles cheese that no one cares about.
Wow. Is that why I don't get pictures on the promos?
Look, you're
All
in
the
Wayne's.
melted.
You're in Wayne's kitchen. Talk to Wayne. I can't wait till he joins the show in a minute. Hello, tons of mice. Hello, Marissa. Hello, Lamar. Hello, Flow State. Hello to all of the people, JD, everybody who's in the chat. Thank you for joining the show today. We're going to talk about Venezuela now. So let's just get to it because this is going to be a long time.
Do we get bathroom breaks?
Yeah, you can take a bathroom break whenever you want. There's no rule against that, Tim.
Okay, I just want to know because we're going to be here for a while.
Yeah, this is a longer day. So, my 8th grade social studies teacher,
Mr. Humble,
Mr. Humble,
taught me things that turns out after doing my own research wasn't exactly the whole story. And this week, we will dive into the popular narrative that it is socialism that killed Venezuela. And sadly, we need to start that by watching. We have to get the opposing view here, guys. I'm sorry. So we're going to watch. You know what? I forgot to pull this up. Let's do it here.
You mean we actually have to address the actual arguments that they're making?
No, I'm just going to play. No. You don't have to do all that. Let me just pull up YouTube here. I should have been more prepared for this. I apologize to the listener. But it'll only take me a second because I want to show you guys one video. Where is this at? Why am I not finding this? PragerU VEN.
Like it's only 20 minutes.
VENEZUELA. I cannot spell today. All right, so we're gonna watch all of one video, which is only about 5 minutes, and the first 2 minutes of a different video that is also from PragerU. So we might as well just get right to these shenanigans, but this will sort of set the narrative for like what the common discourse is about this on the right wing. There are a lot of, in fact, I'm just going to share my entire screen here just to make this a little bit easier, because you have articles everywhere, like, you know, Constitution.net, why did Venezuela fail? The roots of Venezuela from origin. They talk about socialism, how does socialism destroy Venezuela, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So moving over to PragerU, we'll watch this particular video right here real quick. And all right, so this is the PragerU video on Venezuela. If anyone wants to pause this, just yell out pause. But we can also just let it play through and get right through it.
There's no sound.
Oh, there's no sound here? Did I do it wrong? Okay, hold on a second. I can fix that problem.
Why I feel like she tried to dress up as Kamala Harris. Like,
I think it would be wise to introduce who's going to be speaking and the credentials behind the said person.
Yeah, the Debbie D'Souza.
Oh fuck!
Oh,
is that Dinesh D'Souza's sister?
It's probably his wife.
Just as bad.
Because she's from Venezuela. She's from Venezuela,
which automatically makes her an authority.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also
well, that makes her the queen of the country, doesn't it?
Apparently so.
Well, let's watch her read these damn cards.
All right, here we go. So,
and a growing middle class. It's a South American country with a promising future. It had a functioning democracy, a rapidly developing economy, and a growing middle class. All the important indicators, including education, healthcare, and foreign investment, were pointed in the right direction. It was far from perfect, but the mood was hopeful, and with good reason. But now all that promise is gone. The country is a failed state, a hollowed-out shell of its former self. Services like power and water are sporadic. The most basic consumer goods, from bread to toilet paper, are in chronically short supply. Crime has skyrocketed. Freedom of the press is almost non-existent. Democracy has been replaced by a virtual dictatorship. The country is, I'm sorry to say, my beloved Venezuela, a place in which my family has deep roots. I can tell you what happened to it in one word: socialism. In 1999, then candidate for president Hugo Chavez promised to lead the people of Venezuela to a socialist paradise. His theme was Esperanza y Cambio, hope and change. Venezuela is a nation of great wealth, Chavez said, but it's being stolen from its citizens by the evil capitalists and evil corporations. This wrong would be righted, he assured the voters, if they elected him. And they did, to their everlasting regret. Chavez drew inspiration from his mentor, Fidel Castro. Like his mentor, he enjoyed giving speeches that sometimes lasted as many as 7 hours. He even gave himself his own weekly television show, where he would spontaneously break into song. Here's a rule. When your nation's leader starts singing on national television, you're in trouble.
Pause.
Under Chavez, the government of Venezuela took over industry after industry. The government, he assured everyone, would run these businesses better than private enterprise. And the profits would be shared by the people. With great fanfare, he tore up contracts with multinational oil and gas companies.
I couldn't pause because I walked away from the computer, Big Hot. You couldn't see I was gone.
Jesus Christ.
Jeez Louise, go ahead.
So I was going to say, but the moment has kind of passed. Like, if I was the leader of a country, I'd have my own television show.
Yeah.
They forgot about fireside chats.
Right?
And
does playing the saxophone count? Because Bill Clinton did that all the fucking time.
Well, yeah, but he was also a socialist, remember?
Does calling into a show almost every day and talking at length count?
You know what's funny is when you start your video with, well, hold on. Did she already say like the part about when you know someone's singing, you got a problem?
Yeah.
When you start when that's your disqualifier. Anyway, let's continue on with this propaganda machine. Yeah, JD, you're right. It's propaganda.
And demanded that they pay much higher royalties. When they refused, he told them to leave. They did. His image was burnished by Hollywood celebrities who flocked to see the great work he was doing.
Danny Glover, there's trouble.
Taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor. Progressive politicians from...
Was that Harry Belafonte?
Do we know how light-skinned Harry Belafonte is?
I'm like, why would they make him the wrong color?
It's PragerU.
He's freaking high yellow as hell.
That's not even him. They put Wesley Snipes on there.
God,
not even the same guy.
They called him blackness. It was long before Wesley Snipes.
They make it.
And the U.S. and Europe also praised him lavishly.
Not Eddie.
Here's another rule. When Hollywood celebrities visit your country to praise your leader, you're in trouble. When the leader sings on national television and is praised by Hollywood celebrities, you're doomed.
That's your qualifier?
This doesn't make any sense.
Of course it does.
This seems like poisoning the well.
At all.
This seems like just poisoning the well with ad hom with red herring. Just
well, don't worry, the dig will address it.
Socialism always works in the beginning.
Socialism always works in the beginning, she said.
People are fooled.
That's not
in
true.
The beginning. It's easy for governments to confiscate money, but eventually there's no more money to confiscate. In the case of Venezuela, I mean that literally. People who could get money out of the country did. Many left the country altogether. Nearly 2 million, according to Venezuelan sociologist Tomás Paez. The wealth creators continue to create wealth, but they created it somewhere else, Miami or Madrid, and other places around the world. When Chavez...
Did they tell her to go ahead and play up as many accents as she could when she was talking? Madrid!
Like, if she's
gonna like Nacho Libre up in this motherfucker.
If she's gonna do the accent, do it the whole time. Don't just say Fidel Castro with an accent and then move on.
First ran for president in 1999, he said he would leave in 2 years if people weren't happy with him. But, like Castro, Chavez never had any intention of giving up power. He died in office in 2013, replaced by his vice president, Nicolás Maduro. Maduro is Chavez without the charisma or the voice. The country is now a pariah, shunned by the world and isolated. It's so bad that many international airlines refuse to fly there. People stand in lines for hours.
They got Obama at the front of the Venezuelan line.
Yeah, look at that. This is definitely Obama.
Just to get food.
They
Sometimes
got Obama at the
play
front of the
empty-handed.
line.
A
Dutch, we
recent
can't hear you.
survey found that 75% of Venezuelan adults lost weight in 2016.
Oh, so if you want to lose weight, go to Venezuela. That's what they're
Exactly.
An
Dutch,
average
Dutch,
90
Dutch,
pounds.
Dutch, unmute yourself. Jesus fucking Christ.
Oh, I'm on mute. I didn't even realize that.
Of course not.
Yeah, I'm vaping.
This national weight loss program is known cynically as the Maduro diet. Still, Maduro holds on.
I think I'm going to move there and lose the I already lost 19 with COVID, or gained 19 with COVID. Now I'm going to go there and lose on the Maduro diet. I'll be perfect.
Gain the COVID-19.
Opposition leaders and journalists who report the truth are jailed. Venezuela is a cautionary tale. Once a country goes down a socialist path, there's no easy way back. And the
'cause
longer a
it's
country
causes-
stays
causes
socialist,
corruption.
the harder
Pause.
it is to reform it.
Pause.
Okay, that's the
Pause.
end of it anyway. Go ahead.
So the cautionary tale we witnessed back in 1953, 1955. When was Castro's revolution? 55, 59?
I think it was 55.
55. So it was the same thing. A lot of the grievances that Chavez had were the same with Castro. And it was foreign ownership of domestic resources. The United States corporate ownership of Cuba was something like 57% of all land in Cuba was foreign owned by basically by the West. I mean, if we want to boil it down. And all that money was just being extracted. They were paying the local people nothing, or as little as they could, and extracting then the value and bringing it back home, reappropriating it back to the United States. The same thing was happening with Venezuela. The oil companies and everything else were extracting every bit of wealth that they could and paying their peoples as little as they could. This fantasy that they have of this growing middle class wasn't there. It wasn't what you would think it is. The middle class and poverty overseas is not what we view in the United States at all. And what the middle class is what they would call over there, we would view very differently here. And it's disheartening that people will fall for these types of arguments without asking some basic questions. Why were the people pissed to begin with? Why were the people pissed enough to even vote for Chavez? What was, other than the message of hope and change like Obama, what was the actual grievance? And the grievance was all these companies that basically own everything in our nation aren't from here. They're not domestic companies. They're not employing us in the high-paying jobs. We're the grunt workers. We take all the risks. Our workers are dying and getting hurt and not being taken care of. And BP and Shell and everybody else are the ones that are getting rich.
Yeah, and we'll dive into that in the dig in a sec. The thing that I found interesting was, I don't know if they're farming the comments on this video, but the comments are like, an extraordinary amount of the comments are, I'm from Venezuela. I agree. This is completely accurate. Like, there's a lot of people from Venezuela who actually buy into this story as well. I'm going to show you the first 2 minutes of a different video, not so much for the content as for who Prager is marketing this video to, because Prager's getting real fucking crafty. So let's share the screen again here, guys, and take a look at Vivi.
Yeah, cartoons.
Let's go back a sec here. You can hear it this time, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Meet Vivi. She lives in Caracas with her mother and grandmother. She loves to listen to music and dance, but her favorite hobby is making jewelry. She used to sell her pieces in the market, but now no one has any money for jewelry anymore. Vivi's father, Cesar, had to move to Miami, Florida, where he works hard trying to earn enough money for both himself and his family in Caracas. They rely on the valuable American dollars he sends back to help pay for food and a place to live. Lita is Vivi's grandmother, and she remembers the more prosperous days of the 1960s and 70s. Venezuela was a country of hope and opportunity. But by the time Vivi's mother, Maria, was born, a sense of unease and uncertainty had crept in, with the growing divide between the rich and poor. Sadly for Vivi, Caracas is now a place of desperation. Days without electricity and running water sometimes turn into weeks. The fear of violence is always present, and having enough to eat is a challenge when the nation's currency is all but worthless. So how did the discovery of a natural resource like oil transform Vivi's country from a once profitable agricultural nation into a poor, desperate, and chaotic mess?
I wonder what they'll say.
Well, initially, things went very well for the country, as privately owned international companies were invited to drill for oil. The profits were evenly split between the government and private companies.
Okay, we'll talk about that.
Like Shell and Chevron. But when the price of oil dropped in the 1980s, the country lost its primary source of wealth. In a desperate state, the people voted for socialism and to nationalize the oil industry. Socialism is a system where citizens do not own anything individually, and the government controls how things are distributed.
All right, so let's get back into the dig here. And I know that people are going to have a lot to say. I cover a lot of this, and Swede is here for a reason, because he's going to probably extrapolate on a lot of what I say with even more deeper context, okay? And if anyone disagrees with anything, some of this is opinion, but 98% of this is just raw fact. So let's start with those facts. The Venezuelan economy has shrunk by the equivalent of 3 Great Depressions. The currency is destroyed. Over 85% of the population is in poverty, and over 5 million refugees have fled the nation. The story of why Venezuela has collapsed is long and complex. So let's start the day Venezuela was born to 2 loving volcanoes about 500 million years ago. Well, maybe not that far, but we will skip past those, and we'll skip past the dinosaur years too, because we all know T-Rex was a raging capitalist who ate all his opponents. And we'll move to 1492, when Columbus landed in Latin America. Previously, over 30 indigenous groups lived in the region that is now Venezuela. But as we have seen in the U.S., that population lost its land and culture when colonialism from Spain and, for a while, Portugal began. The Spanish settled there in 1522. The Spanish colonists began a very specific, and this is very important because it talks about a lot of Latin America. There was a very specific structure of power with the Spanish-born colonists at the top, who didn't generally stay that long. They would basically get back in their boat and take their riches back to Europe. And the Criollo, or Creole, as we call it in the United States, who are also known as local elites. The Criollo or Creole were born in the colonies, but were of either Portuguese or Spanish descent, and they were basically in the rung below the colonists. One of these people was a man named Simón Bolivar. Of course, the indigenous folks and the imported African slaves, not shockingly, were at the bottom. The colonists and the Creole elites dominated the economy for centuries and owned all the land, all the political power, and all the economic power. Typically, although the Creole are not quite as white as me, the colonists from Europe were. The Creole were lighter skinned, though, than the indigenous, and due to their heritage, they were very easily distinguished from the indigenous and from the slaves. In the early to mid 1800s, these Creole people grew tired of the tyranny of the European crown, rebelled under the leadership of Bolivar, and won independence. Although at the time, Venezuela, Bolivia, Colombia, and some other countries that exist today were not yet distinguished. It was called Gran Colombia at the time. Bolivar died in 1803, and by the end of the 1800s, the Creole had finally driven most of the Spanish colonists out. They took control for themselves. Sound familiar? Probably should. But there's a key difference between the U.S. colonies, who themselves also rebelled, set up governments, established trade, and controlled industry, and what happened in Latin America. These Creole elites were, remember, you got to remember, they were essentially second class during the Spanish rule. And the subsequent wars with the Spanish after Bolivar took control in 1917, up until 1917. So I'm sorry, in 1817. You can read up on the vast history of like when Bolivar took control in 1817, what happened afterwards, and right before that. It's super fascinating. It's super long, but it's way too long to cover here. While not as so, these Creole folks, while they were not as oppressed as the darker skinned people below them, they were still a second class in the beginning. And after the white Europeans mostly left, these Creole elites were the new head honchos. So like what happened in the United States, they also set up governments after they won their revolution, though their revolution lasted a lot longer after they won it. But nonetheless, they set up governments. They established trade relationships with the British and with other European nations, and later with the United States, trading agriculture and mining resources. Unlike the U.S., though, who set up a constitution and moved west as one nation, Latin America was more fractured. And they allowed Europe to control the industrial and the financial sectors. But the Creole people still got paid really, really well. Make no mistake about it. And this is the case in a lot of Latin America. So this is not a unique thing to Venezuela. This is a Latin American issue. GlobalDialogue.com sums up what I just said. Quote, since times and due to the region's subordinate role, strategic resources have remained in the hands of foreigners or European descendants of the Europeans, like the Creole folks. At the same time, most of the region's countries have relied on the export of raw materials, such as cocoa, tobacco, and gold. And this has hampered the economic development, as finished goods, much food, and most medicines must be imported by these countries. Economic turmoil and corruption continued in Venezuela and its neighboring countries as the U.S. became more involved. The U.S. at one point even enforced its Monroe Doctrine to keep European influences out. Of course, the Latin American countries basically traded the Spanish and British influence and German influence for U.S. influence. Maybe not a smart move. The late 1800s to the early 1900s, what happened here is the demand for tobacco and cocoa ended up dropping, and these were the main Venezuelan exports. So, of course, you had economic instability. You had corruption. In fact, corruption was widespread in Venezuela in this time. When you have issues with your economy, one of the things that countries will do is they'll borrow money. So what Venezuela did is they borrowed tons of money around this time, again, late 1800s, early 1900s, and more than it could repay. And in 1902, Venezuela failed to pay the interest on loans from Britain, from Germany, and from Italy. And as a result, those three nations blockaded the Venezuelan ports with their navies. However, in 1914, oil was discovered in Venezuela, and the blockades magically stopped. Oil, of course, became Venezuela's #1 export. By World War II, most of Latin America's Creole elites had shifted their trade to the U.S. because the U.S. had helped them get rid of Europe in exchange for themselves. And of course, the U.S. took over the oil industrial complex and the financial sector dominance. The PragerU video talked about this when they talked about, you know, things were so nice and all these people came in and everybody made money. So these elites, now allied to the U.S., kept power by letting U.S. capitalist ventures such as Chevron, BP, and Shell access their natural resources. Again, this is far from being unique to Venezuela. In fact, it probably sounds super similar to what we talked about with Saudi Arabia a month ago. But let's get specific on Venezuela. Post-World War II Venezuela was actually a bit ahead of the curve as far as economic stability compared to other Latin American countries, although that economic stability was really ahead of the curve only at the top rung. The Creole, who had U.S. relations, had most of that money, and the wealth gap, not surprisingly, was robust. Some more prominent, this part is where I want you guys to really pay attention to this, because this is going to be directly related to the socialism issue, because a lot of people are acting like these problems are new. We've already talked about that these problems existed in 1902 and before then, but like, what about the last 100 years? So some of the more prominent leaders after this time were these three fellas that I'll talk about. Number one, Marcos Perez Jimenez. Again, we're immediately post-World War II. This was in the early 1950s. Marcos Perez Jimenez was the dictator of Venezuela throughout the 1950s. And the guy before him, by the way, also a dictator. Despite being an authoritarian dictator, oil was in demand. Jimenez had it. And as a Creole elite, the U.S. did nothing about it. In fact, a year after dissolving the election that he was losing in the middle of. Okay.
Didn't she call that a functioning democracy?
she did. So, like, let me repeat that. She called it, D'Souza's wife called this a functioning democracy. Jimenez was losing an election, so stopped the count. Where did we hear that? Despite doing that, and keeping power in 1954, the United States responded with extraordinary action. That action was to award Jimenez the Legion of Merit, which is a military award of the Armed Forces gives for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services and achievements. After his exile, he hung out in Miami for a few years on our dime, I'm sure. Then we have another Creole elite, Jamie Lucinchi. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. So it's Lusinchi. I apologize. We'll call him Lucinchi. A populist, classical liberal president. Don't forget what a classical liberal is, because it's not the same as me. In the mid-1980s, whose term saw economic crisis, extreme national debt, currency depreciation, rampant inflation, corruption, not one, but two massacres that he ordered of civilians. Lucinski was popular during his term, but a few years after his term, all the dirt was exposed, including a role in mailing bombs to intimidate judges. Lucinski was put on trial for corruption, told not to leave the country, and of course, fled to Miami. Coincidence only, I'm sure. Anyway, then there's a centrist named Carlos Andres Perez. Perez focused on oil exports. He was actually right before Lucinski, so I screwed this up. But and he nationalized the oil industry in the 1970s as Venezuela became a founding member of OPEC and brought the nation great wealth, which is true. But again, that great wealth went to a very specific people. As a local Creole elite, he also had good relations with the U.S. And despite Perez's excessive and disorderly government spending, by the way, his administration was called the Saudi Venezuela because of its extravagant ambitions. This guy threw money at all types of gaudy stuff. In addition to that, there were allegations of corruption involving members of Perez's intimate circle, such as his mistress, and favors for businessmen who donated to his election campaign. Please stop me when you've heard any of this before. Perez, again, remember, another Creole elite of lighter skin, was impeached, imprisoned, and exiled to
Miami.
Anyone want to guess?
Miami.
You win on our dime again, I would imagine. So are we sensing a theme here? This is sounding so interesting. Rafael Cadara is another president we should talk about. And this guy was a self-proclaimed Christian Democrat. If you look at the platform for them, it's very similar to Bernie Sanders' platform. He rejected capitalism and socialism. Now, Caldera, another Creole elite, rejected Marxist ideas of a class struggle, but he also was convinced that capitalism without social safeguards produces a grossly inequitable society. Long viewed as the most principled and legally minded of Venezuela's presidents, Caldera was a man of learning, a law professor, an accomplished orator, and advocated for social justice globally. Oh, look, all leaders are not complete boneheads, and we report facts. And guess what? He didn't end up having to go to Miami. Read his campaign, read his platforms. They sound a lot like Bernie's. Anyway, remember how we said these Creole elites had power after World War II that was uniformly supported by the U.S. government and by U.S. businesses? Well, in 1999, that all suddenly changed. Why, you ask? Oh, sure, I'll answer that question. It was with the election of Hugo Chavez, the founder and CEO of Dominion Voting Machines. It's nice to have someone on the show who laughs at my dad jokes. Chavez.
Can I say, Robert Evans? Robert Evans, if you're listening, we just gave you a list of people for your Behind the Bastards podcast that you can do, and for all you listeners, after you're done listening to this particular podcast, then you can go listen to the Behind the Bastards on all of these people, because holy crap.
Did you know about all these people already?
Yeah, most of them. But okay. So if you
is
really
anything I'm reporting inaccurate?
No, and actually, it's worse than anything you've ever said too, because if you really want to learn about the nitty-gritty of this, you have to go read the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman. You really have to read that book, because it describes in detail, not necessarily in Venezuela each time, but in detail what we would do to countries. And you can imagine what we did to Venezuela when oil was discovered, because we have to bring them freedom or something. I don't know.
Yeah, and that is...
Gotta liberate them.
That it falls super parallel to what happened in the Middle East, right?
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the U.S.; it was Britain too. But
it happened right along with Iran.
Right along with Iran and Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, all that's like in the 50s. Between 10 and 1960 is when all this shit was happening, and
it got worse after that.
But not really. Like, obviously, what I'm trying to do here is paint a picture of what was happening there, the social inequalities, and the U.S. support is super huge, because we've always supported Venezuela. Like, we always supported Ozzie Guillen's home country. But Haas's one of Haas's favorite people, Ozzie Guillen. So again, remember how we said these Creole elites had power after World War II, and that they were uniformly supported by the U.S. government and by U.S. businesses. And a few of them, even after they were found guilty of corruption and being dictators, the U.S. took them in hand in hand. Oh, come on into Miami. Come to Miami and have a Cuban sandwich. Well, in 1999, again, that changed with the election of Hugo Chavez, again, owner of Dominion. Chavez, who was a military general, had participated in one of the many illegal coup attempts in the nation's history. But when it failed, he went on national television and called for an end to the uprising to avoid more bloodshed and said, look, we tried, we lost. Okay. He then ran for president some years later and won resoundingly. But Chavez was not a Creole elite. He was a descendant of the indigenous and slave population, a radical break in the traditional structure of power in Venezuela. What could go wrong? Chavez, well, your quick gut shot reaction to that, Big Haas.
So you saying what could go wrong?
Well, the fact that Chavez was elected and he was not white skinned, he was dark skinned. Yeah.
Right. My gut shot reaction?
Yes. What's your gut shot reaction?
That generations of elites and descendants of elites ain't gonna really like that too much.
Ah, I knew you say exactly the right thing all the time, Big Hoss. That's why I like you. Glad we went over this before, except we didn't. Now, Chavez was loved by the people and hated by the elites. Chavez is often referred to as a dictator in the West, and that might be somewhat accurate. He did indeed change the Constitution, and he did allow presidents to win unlimited terms. So I'm not sure I would support those two things. However, the PragerU video had said he would leave after 2 years. He was immensely popular after 2 years, but still called another election because his first election was in 1999. He then ran again in 2001 or 2, I forget. So anyway, Chavez implemented policy that was aimed at helping his supporters, the poor, who voted him in, which is something almost as shocking that I've ever. It's one of the more shocking things I've ever heard. An elected official doing what he said he would do. God, I wish we saw that here. Anyway, Chavez cut hunger in half, and growth in the economy shot up in both education and healthcare. Now, Chavez also had a lot of failures. He became more authoritarian in the face of overwhelming scrutiny he faced from the Creole elites. I mean, these people were after him. They basically had a coup in 2002 that took him out of power for a few days. And the people ran to the streets. I didn't even write this in, but they marched in the streets, and the overthrow of the government, like the elites took it back for 3-4 days. The people were like, we will not have it, to quote M'Baku. Now, Chavez,
guess who funded the Creola?
the United States,
Yes.
Chevron, yeah, specifically. So Chavez took power at a time, it just so happened, when oil prices were rising. And they failed to diversify the economy with investment of those profits in other areas or keep any financial reserves. Now, Chavez foolishly assumed that oil was all they needed, like every other president of Venezuela before him.
And keep in mind that the oil coming out of Venezuela is a very dirty, gross, disgusting sludge that is discounted between $20 and $30 a barrel over the prevailing price.
That's good to know. It's not sweet crude?
No, it is not light sweet crude. It is a very dirty, tar sandish level of gross, disgusting oil.
Is it like the Canadian oil?
The old dinosaurs.
It's well, no, it's Permian. And it's
okay. The uninitiated,
extra.
Tell the people what Permian means.
Permian is the era actually right before the dinosaurs, I believe.
I think it's a little before that, actually.
But it's the Permian to the Triassic was the Great Dying, which is where all of our oil comes from. Yeah, actually,
the Permian extinction.
Yes.
So
and which fed into the Triassic, which later into the Triassic you actually get the dinosaurs. Earlier you get the Dimetrodons and things like that are still actually
Dimetrodons count as dinosaurs according to the Jurassic Park. According to Jurassic Park movie, they made them. Anyway,
the legs have to be under the body. Dimetrodon, they don't. Anyway, yeah, it's Permian oil, but it's not the same Permian that you get out of the Permian Basin in Texas, which is a very light, sweet West Texas crude. What it is it's sludge. And if oil is $100 a barrel, if WTI, the West Texas Intermediate, is selling for $100 a barrel, whatever's coming out of Venezuela will be going for roughly $70 to $75 a barrel.
Thank you for that. Interesting. I didn't know that. Real quick, Attorney Anna, were you an expert on Venezuela?
No.
Okay. None of us are, I'm sure, but let me ask you a question. Your thoughts about, you just basically heard about 100 years of Venezuelan, more than 100 years of Venezuelan hierarchy. Mm-hmm. Would you say that it was pretty solid country, or would you say it's kind of more towards turmoil? Like where would you characterize it?
I mean, it sounds like, just from what we've been discussing so far, it just sounds like it's been going through ebbs and flows, depending on whatever the economic situation is and what opportunities have been present. So looks like it might have been going through turmoil for a lot of its history.
I think that's a fair assessment. So we'll keep that analysis in mind. Analysis maker, you.
It was cute. Thank you.
See, so now it's true. Chavez overspent. Okay. It's true. He imprisoned his opponents just like the people before him. It's true. He overdepended on oil, just like all the presidents before him.
And also add in there, he appointed into positions of power into the oil companies themselves, his friends who had no idea what the heck they were doing.
Yeah, you know what? That again, I did see that, and Maduro's done that, did that even more. We can go even deeper into Maduro. Like, I'm not going to touch a ton on Maduro. I got like one paragraph on him, but like, there's a lot of like, nobody is sitting here saying that Chavez was perfect or that he was a great, the greatest leader of, that is not our narrative. Okay. What our narrative is that this is a Venezuelan issue, not a socialism issue. Now, one good thing that Chavez did that the other people before him haven't done is he looked at the wealth gap and said, I'm going to fix this, because he came from that group of people. So you can make an argument that he overspent on social programs, but I kind of think if you're going to overspend on something, it should be social programs. But he also overspent on the military, right? So the main difference was, the only real difference between Chavez and the other leaders outside of his heritage was his relationship with the United States. Chavez was against it. He saw the U.S. and the oil companies as profiting at the expense of his people. And he was right. He opposed foreign oil companies such as Shell and Chevron making huge profits on Venezuelan oil, and implemented policy to cut those U.S. companies' profits to allocate a larger share of those profits towards his social programs. He also opposed the U.S. free trade area of the Americas. Explain what that is to the people briefly.
Free trade is the misnomer that you can put goods and services back and forth between countries without any tariffs and have it be fair.
And the U.S. free trade area of the Americas was basically a way that U.S. companies could skirt having tariffs, right? Yes. So they wanted to be able to, the U.S. established this area, not just in Venezuela, but in Latin America for other stuff, just basically to avoid paying extra money to those countries. So profit for us at their expense. So he opposed this. He also opposed loudly the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Bushy no like that. Beginning in 2013, right before Chavez's death, oil prices fell. Of course, Sidney Powell thinks he's still alive, so I guess we'll see. Was Chavez a good guy? I love that he loves my jokes. Is Chavez a good guy? So it's mixed, right? He was the first to funnel money to the poor instead of just to the Creole elites and their businesses. And by the way, it should be noted that to this day, Venezuela maintains a private sector that is still responsible for most of the nation's economic activity. There were some industries that were nationalized, but the fact of the matter is that Venezuela's economy is 70% private owned, and almost all of that is owned by the Creole elites. We'll get to that in a second, why that's significant.
Can we comment on his usage of authoritarianism? Because I think you have to place some context into why he would do such a thing. And a lot of it has to do with the United States meddling, trying to foment revolution, trying to, overthrow what he was trying to do. And I'm not defending his use of authoritarianism, sure, but I am saying within the context of it and what his grand vision was, I certainly can understand exactly why
Yeah, it's like that it's that Chris Rock line. I'm not saying I condone it, but Haas, what's that line? Come on, give the listener.
But I understand.
Right. He sounds like Chris Rock.
I ain't saying he should have shook her, but I understand.
I'm gonna walk up and smack you. So yeah, and actually I talk a little bit more about the authoritarianism bit in a minute, though I will say I focus more of it on Maduro because Maduro has done what Castro did and like made it way fucking worse. Though there is no question that in the beginning, and I'm ad-libbing now, there is no question that in the Chavez in the beginning of his term and at the end of his life were different people, right? So like he had different policies. He actually was way more in favor of the US businesses being there his first year or so until he kind of figured out what the fuck was going on, like how deep it was. And the guy was constantly being attacked. They try to take him. Now, again, coups are nothing new in Venezuela, right? So he kind of should have expected it. But he was under attack by the US. He was under attack by foreign investors. He was under attack by the people in his own country who own the businesses. The only people who were on his side really was the military and the people. You know, and you could even make an argument that all of the military wasn't. You know, because and we'll see why later. So again, the fact of the matter is that Venezuela's economy is 70% private owned. The majority of the remaining 30% is owned by the state, which raises a key question. This is kind of an aside. Does state ownership qualify as characteristic of democratic social ownership? That is a debated question because you have to ask, do people own the government? Under a true democratic social structure, the people would own the resources, not necessarily the state owned. That's a little bit different. And I want to hear, I do want to hear your thoughts on that, Swede, but put a pin in it and we'll get back to it because I don't want it to be a rabbit hole at the moment, if you don't mind. All right. So again, this is a debated question. I pulled this directly from economists, so we'll get back to that later. Now, there's Maduro. This brings us to Maduro, Nicolas Maduro, of whom there is little good to say. Maduro allows corruption and has granted positions of authority to military leaders to win support of the military, since the business sector is controlled by the local elites, who, of course, would never support him because he used to be a bus driver. And the elites add to the crisis by adding, this is very important, that 70% Creole control of the business sector. They like purposely try to fuck the country up more to create unrest. So they call this using the power of the purse. They create shortages on purpose to try to take power back. That said, Maduro wastes state resources he does have. He's implemented super poor fiscal policy. He's put loyalists on the Supreme Court, basically ripped the court apart in order to keep himself in power. Like, that is why Supreme Courts are so important. This guy super manipulated the Supreme Court. He is far more authoritarian than Chavez. He has meddled with elections, and almost worst of all, he refuses any sort of aid from overseas because he says we'll fix it ourselves. Possibly just as bad, he manipulated the currency. So, weird thing in Venezuela, and I'm not an expert on this, Swede, I'm sure, can elaborate. They basically have two different currencies. You have the currency and then you have a black market currency. So the currency that Maduro and his allies have access to is a stronger type of currency. It's about 10-to-1 on the US dollar. The access, the currency that everyone else has access to, which kind of sold on a black market of sorts, is 3,000 to $1 US.
Cuba runs the same way.
So it's that is one thing that I learned researching this. I had no idea was happening. So Maduro can seriously, he's got some BDE, as Carrie Lake would say. Now let's talk about U.S. sanctions. Three things that are important with sanctions. How do they work? Well, well, two things that are important with sanctions. Number one, how do they work? Well, 80 to 90% of Venezuela's income comes from oil. Oil dropped in the early 2010s, meaning Venezuela would, like any nation, need to borrow. The Obama administration declared Venezuela a national security threat, which is weird, and imposed sanctions in 2014. Thanks, Obama. Trump intensified these sanctions in 2017, designed to block Venezuelan access to foreign financial markets. So basically, Venezuela can't borrow. They can't buy medicine. They can't buy spare parts to keep up their infrastructure. They can't buy anything. This, of course, reduces the investment in and production of that oil. Maduro tried to shift the economy to gold, and guess what Trump did? He sanctioned that too. Economics says that you need exports to pay for imports. But the U.S. pressures other countries from buying from Venezuela as well. Trump, in fact, implemented a full-scale embargo, even blocking Venezuela from getting its own gold reserves back from the UK. Wayne had them in his kitchen. U.S. actions have made it very difficult for Venezuela to get access to money, any money, its own or borrowed, both of which are legal. What's the goal? Well, that's the other question you have to ask about sanctions. What's the goal of the sanction? Looks to me to overthrow a government without bullets, or at least without American bullets. When people start to suffer, it creates what the CIA calls a coup climate. Venezuela has been blocked from buying 300,000 doses of insulin. Think about that. We want to buy insulin. We have the money. 300,000 doses, please. Nope, can't buy it, Trump said. They also tried to buy 1.65 billion worth of food, I think from Haiti, though it could have been from somewhere else. Nope, we blocked that too. John Bolton, in fact, proudly said these sanctions will cost Venezuela $11 billion a year. Our new hero. Yeah, our new hero, by the way, John Bolton, because he doesn't like Trump now. Fuck him. Between 2017 and 2018, it's estimated that 40,000 Venezuelans died, according to the Center for Economic Policy Research. That was pre-COVID. Second to last, I want to talk about violence. So I'm almost done here. I know this has been long, but I mean, this is super important stuff, and we need to be able to talk about this. Let's talk about violence real quick. Most Western nations issue a travel advisory to Venezuela due to the unrest and corruption of the government. That definitely needs attention and change. But is it socialism that's to blame? Well, I'll tell you what. I'm going to read here for you a travel advisory for going to Venezuela. I must have closed it. All right. So Venezuela tourism. Let's Google that and see what it says. People ask, is Venezuela good for tourists? You click on it on Google. It says, do not travel to Venezuela due to crime, civil unrest, poor health infrastructure, kidnapping, and the arrest and detention of U.S. citizens without due process or fair trial guarantees. Exercise caution in Venezuela due to wrongful detentions. Okay. That's all bad. But let's, is it because of socialism? Let's look at neighboring Colombia, which has a thriving market based primarily on oil, mining, agriculture, and manufacturing. Colombia's GDP, by the way, is $226 billion, placing it as what one would call a middle-income country. Let's read their travel advisory in Colombia. Should we say, is tourism safe in Colombia? Violent crime, including armed robbery and homicide, are widespread. Terrorist groups are active in many parts. The U.S. government has limited ability to provide services to U.S. citizens, as a U.S. government personnel travel to these areas is severely restricted due to security concerns. Advised not to travel to Colombia. Sounds to me like it's a Latin American problem, not a Venezuelan socialism problem. I continue. Finally, this is the last part today. and I won't go too deep into this, but there's a lot of shit going on there right now. In 2018 and 2019, Venezuelan presidential crisis, which is essentially a dispute in power between a dictator in Maduro and a self-inaugurated conservative Juan Guaido, I believe you say it, or Guaido, who is in power. It's Guaido. I honestly have heard it pronounced a couple different ways. And mispronouncing shit, it's kind of my thing. It should be noted that Guaido, who is best described as a Creole elite, is recognized by most of the Western powers and both the Trump and Biden administrations. Perhaps the election is illegitimate. Perhaps Guaido is the rightful president. This is a fact. 2018 election turnout was down to 46% in Venezuela from 80% the election prior. So that raises some questions. Maduro won by a razor-thin 1.5% in 2019. We had two elections back-to-back years. Guaido, who never ran for president, ran for the leader of the Legislative Assembly, and then he's claiming that because the election was fraudulent and Maduro was sworn in, that he is the president now due to that. So Guaido was not elected president, for anyone who says that he was. Though Maduro did win by like 1%. So, and with the numbers being as low as possible, Haas and Anna know when we see lower than expected turnout, we have to expect what again? He's on mute, but he's saying voter suppression.
Crazy shit too.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
But I will say Guaido certainly has support, right? There are people who support him. So why do we hear so much about this being attached to socialism instead of what it is, which is authoritarianism and U.S. intervention? So here is a little bit of a red scare hypocrisy of the U.S. media. Have you ever heard of Lula da Silva? In Brazil's 2018 election, da Silva led the polls. He was going to be elected president. He had been president in the 2000s and is widely considered one of the world's best leaders by many. In 2018, he ran again against far-right candidate, I believe it's Jair, J-A-I-R, Bolsonaro. And oddly enough, at that time during the election, he was indicted with financial crimes and imprisoned, which barred him from running. Bolsonaro, I guess, Bolsonaro is probably how you say it, won the election narrowly under the candidate replacing da Silva. And the judge who imprisoned da Silva was given a cabinet position by Bolsonaro.
No.
Soon after, all da Silva's charges were dropped or thrown out, and he was released. And by the way, he's running for president against Bolsonaro right now as we sit here. But the question is this: how many times do we hear about this? How many times do we say, oh, you know what, the U.S. needs to intervene in this and prop up a government? Never, because it was a fucking right-winger who fucking won. Could it be that because da Silva was a left-leaning guy and Bolsonaro was among those on the far right? I don't know. So my closing statement: how does what we learned about Venezuela today and anything else Swede wants to add, how does it change our thoughts on this topic? Did I leave anything out? Yes, there are decades of history I left out, but this is a 20-minute talk, not a 7-hour talk. So let's get to my co-hosts. And did I effectively close the case that this is a Venezuelan, Latin American problem with issues coming from America, American interventionism, and not socialism? That's not to say socialism has no blame at all. But what do you guys think?
I would say socialism has no blame at all, because socialism in that area doesn't exist. If you go by the Stanford Dictionary of Philosophy, which is kind of the gold standard when you look at political economy definitions, their definition of socialism for a state, for anything that is state owned, there has to be a perfect control democracy, and there has to be a power structure in which the people can referendum at will against the government. So it's bottom up instead of top down. For that to exist as socialism, it has to, there's no other way that it could exist within that. The only other, then you get into actually, worker co-op situations and things like that, which could exist. But as far as state ownership, it is very hard for state ownership to maintain itself as socialism because of this, states themselves try to protect their own power.
Yeah, I'll agree to that, because if you look at even other socialist countries, most notably like China, Venezuela hadn't really followed. The only part of socialism that they may have followed is just state control of industry, and they didn't even completely do that. Like, they can't call them a socialist state if the rich still own most of industry. It's more of a oligarchy than a socialist state, because if the rich own 70% of the industry, then that's not socialism. It's oligarchy. That's Russia.
And it's not even a mixed system.
Yeah. that's very typical, like, Russian oligarchy.
And to provide context around what the sanctions are like. So, and it's kind of the same with Cuba. So the United States puts out a notice for the sanctions and the trade sanctions, and says, if you are a trade ship and you dock at a Venezuelan port, you are now banned from docking at any other U.S. allied port for 5 years. Period. So imagine what natural resource could come, and be loaded onto said tanker and sit off some shore for 5 years, and then dock and sell and then bring the money back.
Right.
Yeah. It's such an asinine thing. Now, the United States says that food and medicine and things like that can get in, but they don't.
Yeah, they don't.
Because, okay, when you go in, a container ship is not going to take pure food and pure medicine to Venezuela. A container ship's going to take 13,000 different products,
right,
to fulfill a trade mission. This is a la the trade caravans of the 1200s traveling back and forth between China and Iran to Venice. It's a massive thing, and each cargo tanker is such that you're not a mono product ship. So when you effectively end trade like that, you are ending, as we all know from any economics class we've taken, you are ending the production possibilities curve and any efficiencies of production between nations, where, let's say, nation A is really great at producing insulin and nation B is really great at producing aspirin, and they look at each other and say, you do that and we'll do this, let's trade.
Yeah.
And it works out for everyone. Except for, in this instance, Venezuela is really doing good at A, and anyone that's good at doing B can't trade with them. So what are you going to do? And
right.
So you're stuck trying to nail everything, and all of a sudden you need a screwdriver. And so your entire economy is hamstrung in that vein. It's the United States is the vast majority of the problem for Venezuela. The reason that the corruption and the cronyism happened, a lot of it is because Maduro and Chavez had to protect their power base, because the United States kept trying to overthrow them. The United States would have kept their hands out of it and let the people run it. It probably would have worked, or it would have failed on their own terms.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the problem is, along with the U.S. interventionism, is like I'm sure all the investments in the oil infrastructure in Venezuela by foreign countries, and then the the country being so reliant on the inflation and deflation of the price of oil, like there's so many countries where that is a factor, and it hurts their economy so much to be so reliant on the price of oil that any country that comes in with a bunch of investors says, "Oh, we'll build out your oil infrastructure, and then we'll take that all for ourselves." And those countries don't get the benefit of their oil infrastructure. There's just other countries like China and the US that come in and build out the infrastructure and then take all the oil.
And if you are the revenue sharing agreement of oil is such that it's usually 75-25. So if you go in and drill oil and you're the operator and you're the driller, you get 75% of whatever comes out of the ground, and the landholder gets 25%. That's their quote unquote royalty. And if that's the standard, and you look at what the drilling agreements are and were for, say, Iran, Venezuela, and others, you're going to notice those numbers are different, and they're not in the home country's favor the way they should.
So it's another case of like countries like America coming in, taking the resources, and then just leaving the country to be poor. And that's on top of the tariffs.
And let's say they actually did pay 25% of whatever came out of the ground. They would just lie about what came out of the ground, and that's what happened with Iran in 1953. Was Iran was like, we want to audit BP. And all of a sudden, Iran looked. all of a sudden, BP looked at Britain and the United States and went, "They're gonna find some shit. Our books are cooked worse than kitchen nightmares. We need an overthrow." And that was 1953.
Right? Is there a time where BP can stay out of trouble because?
Deepwater Horizon.
They're always in some shit.
So it's a disturbing pattern around the world of the United States basically sticking their fist up other people and not in a good way.
Yeah. And the sanctions and the tariffs and all that, like you said, they could say that food and medicine's getting through, but you know, you're right. Those container ships contain so many different things that they would never make it through any sort of blockade of a port, or just the port authority saying, "No, you can't come in here because we're tariffed, or we can't take in goods that you got
because you docked near Caracas 4 years and 11 months ago."
Yeah. And there are very few goods that would survive a 5-year wait.
Yeah, on that, number one. And can you wait for it? There's trade finance is 9 months at best.
Yeah.
When you go to the banks for trade finance, which is a level 2 level financing, which most banks would love to have because it's 100% backed by goods that they can turn around and sell. It's 9 months at best. That's all you're going to get. Maybe a year if it's a China to South America, or South Africa, ship. But to add more context to this, you have when Chavez took over, the climate in most of Central and South America was such that for the last 20 years, the United States had assassinated nearly everyone in South America that didn't basically bow their head to the United States.
Right.
And what they would do is they would send an economist in, they would send somebody from, say, Halliburton, who would do this economic study that was it was I don't even know what the right word is, but it was a basic lie.
Maybe a bias.
That was, we need to either build a power plant, or we need to build a dam, or we need to do this, and the electricity production will be XYZ, and the production numbers always flubbed. And then they would say, you know, when you get this electricity built out, you know, all of a sudden production in these other areas and economic activity will flourish in these other areas, which means your, you know, your national GDP and everything else will go up and your tax revenues will go up. And all of a sudden you'll be able to afford this debt payment we're going to throw you under. And it just so happens that these debt payments are based upon, you know, projections that are bullshit. And it happened to Peru, it happened to Bolivia, it happened, the Bolivian rainforest is being destroyed right now. And it has been for the last 15 years for projects based on projections that are bullshit. And the guy that wrote the book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, wrote those projections 20 years ago. And that's one of the stories that he talks about. He's also the architect of the Saudi Arabian money laundering scheme. If you want to read about a fun one,
jeez,
that's a good one. So,
oh, go ahead, finish your thought.
What they would do, and then they would put the debt on you, and once you defaulted on the debt, and you're watching this with China right now with the Belt and Road bullshit that they're trying to pull on the soft power, is that they would force you to, you know, basic economic sanctions that would allow the United States free reign, or any company that the United States would want to give things to, such as Halliburton, and it would basically be handing over assets that belong to the people of country XYZ.
Hey, just real quick, I want to ask Anna a question here, but just real quick, give me your 30-second snapshot. I am suspicious, like the left will defend Chinese Chinese building up infrastructure in other countries, the belt train and whatever it's called. I forget the name. Belt and Road. I am suspicious of it as a sort of like, it seems like American imperialism in some ways. What is your snapshot on that? Like, is it sinister? Is it benign?
You asking me?
No. I was asking Swede that. I have a different question.
Oh,
because they're doing a lot of this in Africa and stuff like that.
Oh, so it's sinister all the way. Look at what they did in Sri Lanka.
Is there anything
they knew boats passed by that.
Yeah, but a lot of socialists are defending it as being benevolent.
Get the fuck out of here.
That's because China's saying that it's benevolent. We're just helping out these other poor countries who don't have the infrastructure. Well, we're building their infrastructure, but what people don't understand is China owns that infrastructure,
right? And I don't like,
and Chinese companies are building the infrastructure,
right?
And also sometimes they're sending Chinese citizens to those countries to build that infrastructure so that they have a presence in those countries as well.
People.
I have no love for China, like. But I know we have to remain honest. Like, just because we want social programs doesn't mean we have to advocate. Like, we can at the same time, Mikey, two things can be true at once. We can be
true.
We can exonerate socialism and socialism as being to blame for the economic collapse of Venezuela, while at the same time being critical of a regime that is communist, which is, you know, extreme socialism in a way, because I'm not just going to defend China because they're not America and because they're, you know, they call themselves communists, even though they have the largest fucking GDP in the world.
China has admitted several times that they're not like a pure socialist state anymore.
Yeah, like I don't think they ever were. They tried to be for 12 years.
And they did. And then a famine happened. A lot of people died. And they decided, oh, we should.
But no one would trade with them. But that's why they had a famine.
Right.
You know, if we
they also killed all the birds that
but the one thing I do want to touch on with Anna, though, real quick is, and again, this is criticism of Nicolas Maduro. And like, this is where things get dangerous. One of the things that he did was he fucked with the Supreme Court. You know, he basically packed the court with loyalists. He didn't do it the same way that we would do it in the United States.
Couldn't imagine that happening.
No, but like you saw it with Trump, right? They basically packed their court with loyalists by stealing at least one, if not two, Supreme Court nominations. You can make a real strong argument that 2 of those were stolen. You know, I think you have to say at least 1, you know, and probably 2 were literally taken away. Depends on how you view the Coney Barrett one. But
the current AG should actually be sitting on the Supreme Court.
Right. Well, and that's what I'm saying. It's like, so they used a certain tactic to take Merrick Garland's, and then but I guess you would have to say, if they didn't use that tactic to take Merrick Garland's, then we couldn't go back and say you can't put in Coney Barrett, right? Like, so like that's why I'm saying I don't want to get on the rabbit hole with that. But anyway, but Maduro did this and obviously has used this to keep himself in power. And then you see an election with, you know, where 80% of the people voted the line before and then 46 the next time, and something's funky there. And the court's, you know, protecting this guy. So like, I know that you're not an expert on the Venezuelan Supreme Court structure, but just in general, why, you know, talk about why a leader would do that and how dangerous that would be for a minute.
Well, I think that a leader, if they would go so far as to interfere with another institution, would probably be doing that for their own personal political gain. I think that that's kind of clear. What might not be as clear as why that is so dangerous. And then I guess whatever type of government structure that you have, when you have someone who is purporting to enforce or carry out the law, interfering with the body that would interpret the laws, that's just a danger, because you don't really, or at least in American government system, those are 2 things that you really don't want to commingle, just because, one, the independence of each branch to the extent that they have checks and balances. And then at the same time, it looks shady to the citizens, because if like you have the person who's interpreting the law being the same person as the person enforcing them, then why would anybody not believe that those 2 entities are not also involved, maybe in a corrupt way, with the people who are actually writing the laws, the legislature? So not really knowing anything about their government and just kind of assuming that it is akin to our government, I think that there's always a danger when one branch of the government is overreaching in a way that looks to have some type of impropriety going on, corruption, nepotism, whatever. It goes on here. So I'm sure if that's happening in the way that it happened with our own Supreme Court, I'm sure it could not have looked too, I guess, too fair, for lack of a better word.
I appreciate that. Let me tell you what I think is happening. I think that once Maduro is out of power, which will probably happen, what's going to happen here is you're going to get another of the Creole elite in power, whether it's Guaido, or the fuck you say it, or whomever. That person is going to be essentially a right-winger. And magically, regardless of who's president, whether it's Obama, whether it's Trump again, whether it's Tulsi fucking Gabbard, whoever, it doesn't fucking matter who it is. Elizabeth Warren, fucking Ron DeSantis, doesn't matter. The U.S. is going to reopen all negotiations with them. They're going to they're going to stop the embargo. They're going to go back in and they're going to have good relations with Venezuela again. And the entire narrative is going to shift to, look, they stopped being socialist and now their currency is fixed. It's going to happen. And it's going to have nothing to do with Venezuela or any change in Venezuela that leader makes. It's going to be us and Britain who get it done.
Yeah, because we don't want China to do it.
It's odd, though, that China hasn't been more involved. Like, you would think that they'd be like...
Because containers come from China to the United States.
Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, they'd probably... U.S. might, yeah, that's a fair point.
But if we wanted to keep that oil infrastructure in, let's say, friendly hands and not Chinese hands, that would be the move. It would be whoever the next guy is, whoever the next president is in Venezuela, probably make nice with him, because I would, if I was China, that would be the move that I would make, because Venezuela is in need of economic rebuild.
But China is in such economic turmoil right now with the demonstrations and the people's revolt against the mortgage payments, and that they're rolling tanks against the people again.
Yeah.
It's China, by estimation, some people are saying is within 60 days of failure. I don't think it's that dire, but there are people, legitimate people, who actually think that the Chinese economic system could fail in 60 days. Evergrande is dragging them into tons of shit. And Evergrande is just the tip of the iceberg. It goes way deeper than that. China is, and I know our conversation's not about China, but China can't really.
No, what
they've got going on right now, they can't go to Venezuela and do it.
Let's have that conversation. We just won't do it today. Let's do that like next month or something. We'll have that conversation, and we'll get Dr. Ernest back, because I know you guys want to talk about some European stuff too. So let's do that next month if you're free. We'll close this out. I want to close this out with some of the culture war shit. Haas and Anna, I know you got to roll soon. I just want your thoughts on the racial part of this. So, like, is this surprising? Is it not surprising? Like, because we hear a lot about race relations in this country, and I'm not saying that, I'm not going to go out there and say it. Maybe you will, that, it just is because Chavez was an indigenous person. Just because of his skin color. I think it's more about the socialism part, but like just the entire structure of Latin America and the power being in the hands of, the European descendants, and the United States' propensity to uplift those people. And this is, and kind of based on what you've seen there, what is your reaction, both of you guys, to those facts? Because those things are indisputable facts. So
I'm not surprised. It happens in every country where there are brown or dark people. I mean, so and it's the same thing in each place. It's not anything different than what goes on in other countries where America intervenes unnecessarily or for their own economic interests. And we don't care. Like the Europeans, Americans, we don't care. And those countries are poor. And a lot of times the racism and discrimination is so deep rooted that it has been going on for centuries. Like when the UK stole basically money from India and then try to give it back to them, making them pay interest on money that they had stolen. Like
partition.
Yeah. So it's like and that's like centuries ago. So there's no way that, even closer in time and history to today. I mean, it's just unsurprising. There's nothing to me that, and it's unfortunate. And maybe that didn't, the color of the people or the fact that they were are Latin American, maybe that has something to do with it. But I think that the fact that they were in the economic situation to be taken advantage of in the first place probably was a result of some type of underlying prejudice.
Big Haas, your thoughts? I mean, I can't think of any leaders that the U.S. has propped up in the Middle East, or maybe in Africa, but not in the Middle East and not in Europe and not in Latin America, that are not super light skinned. It's kind of weird.
I think of it like this. The conditioning of white supremacy is such that there's always that stratification where the more melanin you have in your skin, the lower you are on the societal rung. And if you do happen to, quote unquote, rise above your station, if your rise is not assisted by those lighter on the scale, then your rise will be challenged, minimized, demeaned, demonized, etc., etc. So the presence of natural resources that needed to be exploited is the main driver, because the main driver is always green, money. But if you get the fuck over a darkie in the process, that's just gravy on top of that steak. You see what I mean? So colorism.
Wait, but Obama did it too.
Yeah. Come on, quit playing. What, you think that he is not subject to that? You know, even though he was being vilified for his color here, among the 1% of the 1% of the 1%, he was still protecting their interests. So he was kind of okay with them. You know what I mean? So you have to understand that. Yeah, like I said, if your rise is helped along, facilitated by those lighter on the color wheel, then you know there's a little bit of greasing of the skids, so to speak.
Isn't the prime example of that the Haitian Revolution, where they viewed one side of the island was lighter skinned than the other, and basically it was one side trying to rule over the other, because even though they were all
and just like, you know, over in, like, take for example Sammy Sosa. Now we know Sammy Sosa from his days playing baseball.
Michael Jackson Jr.
And you would not recognize Sammy Sosa if you walk past him on the street today, because he's basically translucent today.
Do you know who Sammy Sosa is, Anna?
Of course I know Sammy Sosa. Don't do too much. Y'all know I know who that is. Y'all trying to be funny.
Have you seen his transformation?
I have seen it. It's unfortunate.
Yeah.
I'll put a picture of it up on the screen. Go ahead.
Okay. So if you want to see,
he already got
like a wax figure.
Mikey is fast tonight. Look at that.
Like, if you want to see a visualization of the effects of white supremacy and colorism in the world, there you have it. Okay. And that is a socio-political thing as well. You know, because
he's a beloved figure in Chicago.
Exactly. But still, the self-hatred was ingrained so much. That's what he doing out and did. You know, and then when you think about, you know, think about this. Close your eyes and imagine the person who said grab him by the pussy and paid off a porn star and cheated on every one of his wives and all of that stuff was
almost sold America.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying, even before they were elected president, imagine that person was named Barack Obama. Does he get even on the ticket?
No.
To be considered for president.
You think Barack Obama running a casino in the ground would allow him to even be on a ticket?
Right. That's what I'm saying.
Filing for bankruptcy 4 times.
He wouldn't even get a loan for a casino. He wouldn't even have got the loan.
Well, and imagine him giving. Look, this is the thing with Trump. And I'll ask one more question about Venezuela before we go.
My overarching point on that is the color wheel, the complexion for the protection. That is what we're talking about. And that is what, you know, in the pursuit of green, it's always good if the darker people on the color wheel are the ones being run amok, like China's doing in Africa and things like that.
Yeah.
But go ahead, Dutch. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to make a quick point that Trump had 80-something% support among white evangelical Christians.
Yeah. As an adulterer.
You know that his support number from non-white evangelical Christians,
it's probably about 60-70%.
60% against, 67% against. So his support was about a third from non-white evangelical Christians, but 80-something% from white evangelical Christians.
Oh, I wonder why.
That is well, they voted more white. I heard somebody say once they voted more white than evangelical.
Well, actually, Trump made a lot of progress with the Latino community in the South because they were evangelical or Christian, and he was running ads in Spanish saying that, oh, voting for Trump, because there are a lot of specifically like Puerto Ricans or Mexicans who are very Christian conservative, but they don't vote with Republicans most of the time because they don't feel like they're represented. But Trump was putting out ads in Spanish in Texas and Florida and all those states, and he actually made up like 10 points by doing that.
And
and that's why you see Rubio popular in Florida.
Yeah, and that's another thing too, is that in my experience and looking across the landscape, the lighter the Latino, the more that proximity to whiteness is very seductive.
Rubio and Cruz.
Yeah,
Rubio and Cruz.
It's astonishing to me that you have you have a lot of Venezuelans who are conservative. You can understand, part of it, right? But yeah, and same with Cubans. They come here but they're holding authoritarianism. They're holding the Democratic Party responsible for authoritarianism that's taking place in a different country that has nothing to do with our Democratic Party.
Yeah,
and the propensity for what I like to call your Americanized Latino, their support for the Republican Party is pretty fucking staunch.
Oh yeah. Oh, we know a guy
Omar.
A guy.
Yeah. And I love Omar. He's my friend for decades, but he's a fucking idiot.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, like Melissa's family. It's exactly this, right? And it's like it's amazing to me how these assimilated Hispanics are so staunchly conservative, and it's not that surprising, but it isn't surprising because it's a weird thing.
Well, the Democrats were completely caught off guard by it in 2020. They thought they would have been closer in Florida. They were. They thought they would have been closer in Florida.
Idiots.
But I think they made the calculation that though that particular group of voters will vote based on being disenfranchised because of their race and not really fully understanding the impact of religion on certain cultures. And also the fact that people had experience with what had been labeled as socialism, and that when that word was weaponized here, that it meant different things and evoked different emotions than certain folks who were using the word in a different context.
Well, and also a lot of them, sadly, the more successful, and this goes for Black people too, the more successful that a Latino is, especially when they're of lighter skin color, the higher the propensity for them to be GOP.
Yeah.
They kind of look at it as they're like, well, I'm Hispanic, but I did this, so anyone can. But yeah, but you're like one shade away from me.
Well, if you want to know where the delineation between voting one party or the other is, it's mostly 800 people per square mile. It's density.
Yeah.
It's really you can draw lines at population density, and it instant change from red to blue.
Yep, that's exactly correct.
That is very true.
And the number is 800 people per square mile.
All right, so let's close this off. Just real quick, I just want to. I know that Tim and Swede kind of know a little bit about Venezuela coming in. Haas and Anna, I'm not sure what you guys knew. I don't want to presume, but just my quick thoughts is your takeaways from this and then we'll and like, do you feel better prepared to have this conversation, or is there anything that you'd want to ask Swede for context, because he's really the expert here, not me?
I learned a lot today, especially about their past history and the past, I guess, for lack of a better term, leadership, presidents, and things like that. You know, I kind of knew, you know, about the American and foreign and international meddling and that role in the destabilization of Venezuela, you know, but I learned a lot more today, so that's good. You know, corporations, you know, when the green is in effect, you know, those big corporations especially are going to put that thumb down as much as they can. So
cool. Anna, any thought?
Yeah, no, same thing. I didn't really know too much about the overall political history of the country as far as leadership. So that's really interesting to learn and to know. And I don't know, sometimes I just can't help but notice the overlap between what we do, what other countries do, and then what we think is bad. Like, it's kind of crazy, because it's like, look at us. It's like the Spider-Man meme.
It is like the spider with everyone pointing. Tim, next time you go to Florida, to Miami specifically, you're going to grab a Cuban sandwich and visit the retirement home for ousted Venezuelan leaders that's somewhere.
There's actually a singular hotel where they all live.
Wow.
Right next. Yeah, it's crazy.
It's the Clevelander.
Close us out, Swede. Any last thought you think is important that was glossed over, and then we'll sign off and go as soon as the show ends, folks. Go to Haas's Humidor YouTube channel, or we'll be back with the Humidor. So, Swede,
monovariant causational thinking, or binary thinking, or whatever you want to call it, is always a mistake, especially when you're talking about countries and failures.
This is number 4, by the way. You're giving us number 4 right now, the one that will amaze people.
Yeah, and it really shows a lack of wanting to truly understand what the underlying causations are for either a failed state or a successful state, going all the way through its history and everything else. You tend to learn quite a bit more about the context and the nuance. But that's hard, and it's very difficult. And while you did a great job summarizing things, you can get a PhD on Venezuelan history 1812 to 1830. You know, that there's that much there that you could seriously do that much study on it. So, I mean, Simón Bolivar alone is a fantastic story to read.
Yeah, and I only read 2 sentences on him. So
there's a cigar named after him.
There's
a country named after him,
and kicking the Spanish out, and it's a fascinating story, and it's a fascinating read as far as how they tried to set up their own institutions and how much Spain influenced those institutions and influenced the colorism and everything else as far as the caste. You know, it was a caste system. It really was.
And that's not unique to
Venezuela. India does it.
No. And well, in Korea, China, I mean, racism, let's be real. Racism is not a United States problem. It's a worldwide problem, and it's absolutely worse elsewhere. The thing that makes the United States especially unique is we have a really hard time admitting it.
Yeah. and actually doing anything about it.
Well, you know, they said there was a line in The Boys that said being American is sweeping all your dirty shit under the rug. Remember remember the legend said it, and because you're the hero.
Yeah. Well, and we're not the only, and even that problem is not unique to us. Go to Japan and ask them about Nanking.
I thought we were the greatest country in the world.
Yeah.
Though. Oh yeah. Well, Japan has huge issues. The problem is, people who say United States is the greatest country in the world, isn't part of being great owning your mistakes?
And trying to be better.
No.
No, not according to
What?
our country.
I mean, in essence, if you looked at everything, the point that I would try to make to everyone out there who is listening to this and thinks that we're a bunch of idiots, you can think that, but please understand that a failed state has 40 causes, not one. It has, a successful state has 40 causes, not one.
Much like any problem.
Much like every problem out there. Yeah. And the problem is people try to delineate things down to a monovariant analysis. It's one thing that you can point to because it's easy to do that.
Right. That's the lowest common denominator. You know what I mean? And it's like, no, there's a lot of things that go into it, and there's a lot of things that would have to happen for the solution.